Thank you for joining us today for our Creating Transformative Systems conference, and specifically for this panel, From Policy to Practice, Advancing Survivor-Informed Political Advocacy. My name is Kelly Klinger. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the Membership Engagement Specialist at NJ CASA. I am an Asian woman. I have medium-length dark hair, wearing glasses and a red blouse. I am sitting in front of a blurred white background. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome our three wonderful panelists today. I'll be introducing each of them shortly. Panelists, when you begin speaking, please mention a brief image background description as I just demonstrated. First, I would like to introduce Imagine Goddard. Imagine Goddard has been teaching and speaking about feminism and sexuality for over 2 decades, including her TEDx talk, Owning Your Sexual Power. Her award-winning film, At Your Cervix, examines patient consent and bodily autonomy in gynecology and medical education, aiming to end unethical practices that harm both patients and medical students. She is committed to helping people have hard conversations and take the step that leads to liberation. Welcome, Imagine.
Thank you so much. I have dirty blonde hair, they might call it, and light skin. I am wearing a sea green shirt, and I have a large plant and a drum and books behind me.
Thank you, Imagine, and welcome again. Next, we have Samantha Jo Dato. Samantha Jo Dato, a humanitarian, author, philanthropist, and freedom fighter and bridge builder from Atlantic City, New Jersey, and I'm also from Atlantic City, has found it essential to bring the voices of all oppressed people into the conversation with an underline on LGBTQIA and queer issues and a boldness on Black liberation. Jo Dato has been on the front lines serving the most disproportionately impacted individuals affected by structural and state-sanctioned violence for over 20 years on a global and national level. Welcome again, Samantha.
My name is Samantha Jo Dato. I am giving a description of a caramel Black trans woman with center part highlighted orange hair behind a Black blurred background in an olive green blazer and top. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Samantha. Next, we have Toshira Maldonado. Toshira Maldonado, a passionate Black maternal health advocate, is from Southern New Jersey. She is the executive director of Most Beautiful Womb, centering her work around maternal wellness and improving BIPOC family functioning. She is a New Jersey Birth Justice Institute Fellow, a full-spectrum doula, and a certified outreach perinatal educator through Common Sense Childbirth Institute. Hi, Toshira.
My name is Toshira Maldonado. I'm also from Atlantic City. I have a background of a tree with hues of mauve and orange, which are healing colors. My hair is thick and curly with a middle part. I have on glasses, and I have a bright blue and red and Black African print top with large bamboo earrings in my ear.
Thank you, Toshira. I love all the South Jersey representation we have here, but thank you all for your introductions. And given all your experience and expertise, I'm looking forward to having a really robust conversation. So with that, let's get started into our first question. This first question, you all will have the opportunity to answer. So the first question is, we know that survivors of sexual violence are impacted by public policy in many different ways, whether that be through policies surrounding housing, healthcare, financial assistance, and economic and social policy more broadly. Can you speak to these intersections and why it is important for all public policy to be survivor informed?
I believe that public policy needs to be survivor informed as well as community led in the approach of addressing the needs of the most marginalized. It's important that the historical antecedents of trauma that lie within the cultural dynamics of the people of New Jersey, as well as all across the country where injustices lie, it's important that policy reflects the cultural diversity, as well as the experiences, the lived experiences, and how can we move forward if it doesn't reflect the needs of the people where the people have the strongest voice. So I believe public policy is not public policy when it's not people facing. And it's important that the people organize as well as be constituents of structuring their own freedoms within the protections of the law.
I could piggyback off of that. It's Samantha Jo Dado. I believe that when we say public policy, we are talking about the communities that we live in and the people that make these policies. It can't be survivor-based or informed if it's not reaching the communities that we serve. We all know that sexual SA is right next door. It could be in our own home, and it's something that really is not talked about or tabooed in POC or Black families. And getting this message across means that we have to listen to our constituents and our community members. We can't do that without their voice. So I think that when you're meeting someone where they're at, a community member where they're at, they may be healing from SA or some kind of other ism that comes into place, or some kind of other phobia. So to make public policy, it can't be about the 1%. It has to be about the communities that you're trying to serve in this scenario.
I'm the director and producer of At Your Cervix, and we've been using the film to affect legislation. The film is very much an advocacy tool. And so I've been getting a crash course in how legislative processes work as we've been working with legislators across the country to pass laws in multiple states. And oftentimes the lawmakers are very grateful for the information that we bring and that also their constituents in the community bring, patients who have experienced things bring, because they don't know anything about the issue. When they hear about it, they are shocked and can't believe we have to have the conversation about making a law to make doing exams on anesthetized patients without their consent illegal, because it feels like that should already be a given. It's not. And so they know very, very little about this. And my experience so far really has been that they very much value having community input. They want community input. And again, that may be based on some of the legislators we've gotten to work with. That may not be the same across the board. But there's no way they would be able to draft laws that would effectively address this issue without hearing from community. That is just absolutely essential in the process. And it varies from state to state. It varies across the country. So sometimes it's hard to know what are the ways to get the right voices heard. When are the hearings happening? What does that look like? What does it mean to go in and testify? That can sound really heavy for a lot of people. And so I think a lot of times that can scare away community members who have something to say and whose voices need to be heard in order for whatever policy is being worked on to really affect those communities and lift up those communities. So it's absolutely essential that collaboration happen.
So Shira Maldonado speaking. To your point, Imagine, I couldn't agree more that the policy behind what needs to be addressed in terms of the disenfranchisement that is caused by SA, we need our lawmakers and those with the influence to understand that there is a difference in who gets believed over who gets the protection. And in removing the stigmas that are attached to SA, as Samantha shared, in BIPOC communities and Latinx communities, we have to also recognize the historical antecedents of trauma. That is something that the policy makers, activists, organizers, and whoever falls on a continuum of social justice, oftentimes it's a conversation that has to get an appointment. And we have to become more comfortable with amplifying the voices of those who are not believed. You know, SA for a Black woman means something totally different for a white woman. SA for our trans community means something totally different for the mainstream white community. Why is that? We all hurt the same. The trauma cannot be quantified, however, the disparities can. And until we look at the order of humanity, that everyone has the right to liberty and the pursuit of happiness, you know, as our Constitution affords, at least it promises, until policy and lawmakers can break down those barriers and the social stigmas and the taboos that are attached to certain communities and look at it in totality as it is wrong, it is unjust, and we have to work towards social change and restorative justice for everyone. One nation under God, indivisible. You know, just as we grew up saying in school in the Pledge of Allegiance, we should be living up to that. And SA is one of the most detrimental offenses against humanity. And your life is never the same after it. And it does not matter what race, creed, culture, color, sexual orientation, your money doesn't even save you. Your education doesn't save you. And policy must reflect true restorative justice. After we put the laws out, where is the call to action to ensure our protections and freedom?
Thank you. Thank you. That was really, really insightful. I actually wrote down a few notes. I mean, I just want to say, imagine, I think we all could use a crash course on legislative policy. There's so many moving parts. It's multifaceted, and we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to advocate for survivors of sexual assault, especially marginalized and BIPOC communities, for sure. And the other thing I really want to uplift both from Samantha and Toshira was saying that policy needs to be people facing, right? And who we are serving. And specifically our communities, because we have gotten to know our communities and we are the best advocates to really show policymakers what it's like to be in that community and what they really need. So thank you.
Can I also share one of the biggest issues is that we have to wait for policy to be translated into how it affects us on our day-to-day. Like, policy law is like a whole nother language. It has such a different scope of wording and how it's applied. Like, I don't think that they do justice. We have to wait for a nonprofit who's already overworked to translate how it hits the ground. And I think a lot of us community members or our constituents are behind the 8 ball when it comes to how important it is. You don't know, like, something may come up in policy and it's not translated and they're not going to translate it for us. And I do believe it's their job to. If we can make accessible accounts for people who are speaking other languages, we have to also make accounts for understanding that policy and bills are other languages that most people in my community cannot translate. And they need to do that work, because when we're doing free labor for them as nonprofits or advocacy groups, and by the time we reach the masses, the bill has already passed. It's already been to the floor. It's already done these things. And the roar is coming back. And now it looks like we're reacting to something when it didn't get out fairly.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Samantha. It is very true. And unfortunately, we see policies being created after lived experiences were shared, and then anticipated repercussions or anticipated outcomes, when really we should be working to prevent that. So thank you. And actually with that, I would like to direct the next question to you, Samantha. How do we get the attention of politicians about our advocacy work, especially when it isn't their priority or on their radar? What strategies have been effective in fostering meaningful partnerships between community organizers and policymakers to ensure that policies are responsive to the needs and priorities of marginalized communities?
So let me give you this. I think living and moving with truth, freedom, and understanding, we know that the outdated policies and the history of this country is built on a lie. It's also hard to navigate for the holders of truth, both personally and professionally. And when we find our people and see us and living in this world with deep insight, it's tough orbiting around this world or just through spaces with that kind of insight. The outdated model is still being used and it should really be thrown out. But until then, we have to do some work and find out the people with the proven evidence, that policies and bills that are in alignment with your own views. Research has shown that victim-centered, trauma-informed policies will push us into a holistic healing and caring for survivors that is best done with insight. Could you imagine an SA survivor being able to take leave of absence or having free intensive therapy and medical care that helps us with individualized recovery? I want this now. I want it today and forever. It puzzles me that in a world full of updates, revises, addendums, that we still just can't get it right. We're putting people who have the intersections of lived experience, informed training, compassion, and qualified humans at the table to help with matters like this. In a country with over 340 billion people alive, you can't find the correct folks to make the change. We know it's not because that they're not out there, and because this country holds on to its lies and keeps those people in place that continue to share their lies. The thought of us coming together and being the answer for our problem scares the people in power. Knowing that these systems will never save us, we have to think about the words taking up space in these places, not only to be the complainant, but we need to start being the equal counterpart to the answers that they need us to have. The ones who block the bills and demand inclusion and answers for the ludicrous things that they continue to do, imagine us becoming the committee members, the council members, the board members, or any elected official telling us that we want change, or telling us that you want to be the change that we need. I believe that we'll all rally around you. I know that we will all rally around you and help you get there. We need more like-minded, forward-thinking ideas more than ever now, because the folks that are in office currently aren't getting it. We cannot waste more necessary time begging for change when we can have the people that are more like us running and being in these spaces on a local and a state level. We can't demand answers and push back on every bill that takes away our freedom as an SA survivor if you don't understand it. So I think we need to be more intentional by getting into those spaces.
Thank you, Samantha. I agree. Our movement is very powerful. And if we had someone in the office, like, we could do really unstoppable things. So absolutely. We have a few moments. I would like to open it up for Toshira or Imagine if there's any few thoughts you would like to add or strategies.
Well, I will say that it is very important that as we pay attention to the times and the disparities, particularly among Black and Brown women, where right here in New Jersey, we're 7 times more likely to die. We also see another element of the maternal health crisis where women are literally ending their lives because of mental health components that oftentimes go unaddressed and undiagnosed or misdiagnosed. And when we look at our lives and our lived experiences that hold so much pain, in many of our lives is SA that goes again unaddressed, because culturally in the BIPOC and Latinx communities, we don't talk about it. We make excuses for it. We tend to criminalize as well as punish the female. You know, men somehow get to escape. And then we don't want to get caught up in the male-female domination factor, because women can be perpetrators too. And it's important that we look at it in terms of healing and restorative justice. We can talk about the fragments all day. We can talk about the pain, the devastation. We can talk about the generational patterns all day long, because we see it. Usually, if it goes unaddressed, not talked about, we're going to pass those traumas on. I can use my lived experience. I come from a family that's possibly outside of slavery 5 generations. And within my family, this is something that 1 in 3 people can say, yeah, we share the history of SA. And it didn't happen out in the world. It didn't happen among strangers. It happened within our families. So that's one thing that we have to keep in mind, that these are people in the community, oftentimes in grassroots organizations, working passionately for organizations like yours that amplify the message of restorative justice as it relates to SA, as well as the restorative components that have to do with our mental health. It is important that we focus on the connections and the intersections of maternal mental health, as well as our children that are impacted by parents who went through these challenges. We're just not looking at policy that protects us from a crime, because clearly we know that it's a crime. If you assault someone, if there's, sexual assault, rape, in all the different forms, that's a crime. It's wrong. It carries heavy penalties. That's on the surface, that's a given. But then the harm internally in our families and in our communities, there's not enough policy built around healing. There's not enough policy built around accountability. That sexual trauma can come from the medical community. It can often come from our educational system. It can often come from within the community, as well as the entertainment industry, what we see on TV, the censorship. There's so many different levels of it and how we're negatively impacted. And I think we must amplify the voice and the message that in order for us to move forward with freedom and the autonomy over our own bodies and to be able to have voice and choice, we have to begin another conversation that demands action, because there's not a whole lot to protect us and save us from the aftermath. And I feel like that's a part of survivor justice, recognizing that we need communal healing and we need resources and funding that supports this, because there's not enough of it.
I mean, there's a lot of strategies for reaching policymakers, and I don't think any one strategy works with everyone. So I think we have to be using multiple strategies. I mean, sometimes we can reach a policymaker or one of our representatives through social media by doing something really impactful online, by tagging them repeatedly on an issue and until it gets their attention. I mean, that can work. Not with everybody, but that can work with some folks. This past week, I showed my film locally. There is not a law banning medical sexual assault in the state of New Mexico, where I live. And we invited every local legislator to attend the screening. And out of probably a dozen invites, 1 showed up. But that one person, who we also had our eye on as being someone who would be a good person to sponsor a bill on this issue, which we've already tried, was written and was killed in committee. So we're sort of back at the drawing board again and needing new legislators. She showed up at the screening, and as we were talking about the need for legislative work in this state, she stood up and said, I want to work with you. I want to do a bill on this. So, for me, that was such a huge driving force for why I stayed with my film, because I know the power of film. I know that film can change hearts, can change minds, and it did that in this instance, at least at the beginning. We'll see what happens, but it also depends what kind of state you're in. I've lived most of my life in California and New York, which are really big states. And I would never get a text message from a legislator in a state like that. But here in New Mexico, a legislator texted me about the issue when they heard about it and got my number. I was baffled by that. I had never experienced something like that. And we ended up having lunch the next week. So sometimes in smaller states, things like that are possible if you reach to the right person and you know that they're going to be someone that's going to be supportive of what you want to get done legislatively.
That is really amazing. Imagine. I'm so glad to hear that your event went well and you had a representative show up. And thank you for sharing those strategies. And Toshira, thank you for sharing your lived experience and speaking truth to the histories of systemic oppression. So how do we address the influences of systemic oppression that is embedded in and enforced through public policy? How do policymakers build trust with marginalized communities after centuries of causing harm?
Trust can be built when we first can understand what the ask is. Trust can be built when our policymakers come without an agenda. We only hear from our policymakers and our lawmakers and those who are running for office around the time of election. We get broken promises, and, they tend to hear our cries and see our struggles, but then after the vote, then what happens? So I feel to build trust, it means coming in and do some education. I shared earlier, education is key. Community-based education that leads to change includes social justice, letting us know that we have a voice and then welcoming us into the spaces where our voices will be heard. That's very important. Hosting, community-based engagement with coming into the community. That's how you're going to build trust. You're going to build trust when we see you and we don't see you around election time. You're going to build trust within our community when you speak our language. And the language that we need to be spoken to in is the language of solidarity, is the language of respect, is the language of humane treatment. Those are the buzzwords that we need to hear politicians speak. We need to see the action behind the talk. I don't know if I can be any more plain that if people remain in the dark and if people remain secluded as well as traumatized on top of the disparities that become an automatic simply because of the check mark beside their ethnicity, there's nothing we can do to change being Black people. There's nothing we can do to change our experiences of things that we didn't ask for that go way, way back in our history, and that has even cycled into our families. But politicians have a responsibility to the constituents who they serve to make them feel safe, number one. Building trust means safety. Building trust means that you're accessible. Building trust also means that you are known to have impact and influence that actually is touching the people. How do you touch the people? You touch the people with funding. You touch the people with building up their communities where we are in a space of safety, building safety pavilions where there's resources and there's access to everything that we need. Because again, I'll reiterate it, this goes back many, many years. The trauma that has been caused in BIPOC and Latinx communities, it all has a starting point. And the capitalism, as well as deep-seated elements of colonization, still lives within our communities. And the only way that will move is if those who caused the trauma and the devastation begin to fix it. When we look at our politicians and our lawmakers, they are the same people front facing that brought us over in chains. They have the same blood of the oppressors. And so how can we build trust is through hearing the apologies and then seeing the restorative justice reflected by policies, bills, practice, best practice, as well as empowerment in communities of color that oftentimes are the major contributors to political structures. You know, without being partisan and without taking sides, we know who supports what agenda. And we are never going to be able to move past public policy that is not people facing if we don't make the politicians face the people. And I don't know how to be any more plainer than that.
I think one of the main things about building trust is telling and sharing the truth, right? I think we can't move forward, or you can't get your constituencies' ear or your community's ear because there's no truth in what you're sharing with us. In those meetings, in those conversations, you come with an agenda like for your own political gain, but it does not serve the communities, or it doesn't show any respect that you're in a space to do the work for this community. And I think a lot of people are smelling, you know, the jive or you know, the BS that's coming with policymakers. They're understanding and they're catching on that they talk a good game in your face and then they don't follow through with that. All of our communities are systematically oppressed. We're putting to poor HUD housing into the lowest parts of the community that are depleted. We're putting into the worst education systems. We're given no fair chance for promotion and growth. We are usually put out of our homes, or a lot of us are working for our home because there is no generational wealth that came down through the ancestors that we have, right? And I think that policymakers don't ever show the intention to share that information, to say that I know what's going on around here. I know where you live. I know what school district you came from. I'm trying to check off the box. And if they can't do it, to have someone that they know and is working with that can do it. We understand that all policymakers can't do everything all at once, but the things that you do, you have to do well and with intention. And they're missing the communities because they're coming and serving us jive or BS or what they consider a talking point to get a vote or to get us into that space. And we are respectful human beings who are now calling it or thinking it, but not saying it. So I think that the biggest issue is policymakers are not walking away winning our hearts. They're not walking away with their proven track records of a place that's not just trustful and truthful. Sometimes they may not have the answer to that. They may not know. And that honesty is much more respected. And I don't think that they're coming in with that kind of guard down or that kind of transparency to be in conversation with us. And that is where they're losing us at. I think you can't build any kind of trust until you start to tell the truth. And the truth looks like you failed, you messed up, America is not great, and you're in this mud pile trying to get clean water out of a muddy pond. So, you know, that is, I think, where we're at right now. And that has to have some truth, because we need to start boiling some water now, because muddy water is only going to get clear if we start adding heat to it.
That's such a good metaphor. I mean, they're actively coming after us right now. They're coming after trans folks and LGBTQ plus communities. They've been, the systems have been designed not to support people of color, and anti-Black racism is baked into these systems, and so much policy that, I mean, we have to be loud, we have to engage with it. I mean, policy impacts all of us, and the more that we are engaged with it, and also the more that we get our folks, members of our community, to run for office and be in positions where they can help us, like we have to be doing that. We have to be. Doing work outside of the system is important, and also having people that can work inside the system to create real change and to make them listen. Many of them don't want to listen. They're not going to listen. And so by us being loud and educating communities and mobilizing communities and doing our organizing, that is how we're going to get things heard. And if we're not showing up to that process, as we are seeing, they will just pass laws that are horrendous and are going to have horrible impacts on us and our communities that we then need to go back and fix, on top of trying to get the laws that actually would help us truly in our lives to live safely, to not be doubly victimized by the systems when we've already been harmed in whatever way, whether it's sexual assault or other kinds of violence, or lack of resources, lack of services. That we have to just be working on so many fronts.
Wow, thank you. Thank you. All these conversations have been so robust and so helpful, and really important. It's so true. If we want policymakers to build trust, it's coming out beyond your expected election time or your agenda, right? I loved, Toshira, that you said, come without an agenda. That is the most informal yet productive way, I think, that you could really get to know someone. And Samantha, like you said, learn the community. If you're coming in with an agenda, where are you leaving space to learn about the community? So these are really, truly great points. And thank you all for being so honest, and for your candor, and just being the voice and being able to speak it out loud. Imagine, I would like to direct this next question to you. So we know that in your advocacy work, you mentioned that you built connections with medical students who wanted to see more trauma-informed practices in their field, but lacked the positional power to implement those changes. How can political policy be used as an avenue to encourage people who work within different sectors, such as education, healthcare, corporate, and many more, to feel empowered to speak out and influence real change?
It's not easy. At Your Cervix is about the use of patient bodies to teach medical students while we are asleep. And this happens across the country, and it's been happening since the beginning of gynecology, and I would say since the beginning of medicine. Students are put in a really horrible position, a really untenable position. They are asked, as part of their medical education, to violate patients repeatedly, routinely. This is a systemic issue. This happens all over the country. This isn't like one kind of institution. It's not one state. It's not like rural versus city. Research recently was done that actually looked at different kinds of facilities to see, is there a difference? And what they found was that there was not really a great difference, that these non-consensual exams, which have now been named medical sexual assault in the literature, just as of last year, there was a really excellent piece put out that is calling this medical sexual assault. And I think that's hard language for people in medicine to hear, especially if they've been doing this and teaching this way, because they're like, well, that's how I learned. I was just ushered into an operating room and told to do exams on patients who were under anesthesia, who never knew about it and never consented. And that's how I'm teaching my students now. And that's how this has just gotten reproduced over and over again and perpetuated and hasn't changed. Medicine in particular, which really is the system that we're taking on in, in this film and in the many larger issues that impact it. It is it very much falls outside of a lot of typical norms, in the sense that oftentimes there's very little oversight. It's doctors that are in charge of, investigative processes when something goes wrong, or, medical boards that are full of medical doctors that actually don't have regular people like you and I. John Oliver just did a piece about this and talking about like that we need regular folks from the community to be a part of those medical boards. If the medical boards that are the ones that are going to be, imposing any kind of, removal of license, question of the accreditation of a facility, or any other kind of consequence because of an action, if those medical boards are stacked with doctors and doctors tend to just protect the doctors, then what we have are people that repeatedly abuse their patients or repeatedly engage in whatever unethical act is being addressed. So that's another place where we need to have regular folks, people that can advocate, people that understand the system to be a part of it. And I'm sure that there are similar kinds of boards in other systems. The students are basically at the bottom of a very intense hierarchy. Medicine is an incredibly rigid hierarchy, and students are at the bottom of that hierarchy. They are expected to do what they're told. They are expected to say yes. It actually is not unlike the military, I feel like, in many of the ways that the students are like brought into, this is how we do things here. And, oh no, we don't have time for consent. We can't do that. You just go in and you do it. I mean, I've heard stories like that from students over and over again. I've heard stories of students being made fun of because they cared about bodily autonomy and they questioned something. There have been many stories of students facing retribution because they have spoken up. And At Your Cervix, we share several student stories of students that did do something to push back, that did try to speak up, or that avoided doing the thing that would cause moral injury to them so that they could maintain their own integrity, but didn't know how to speak up. And so, I mean, they are up against an immense system. And a student who cannot actually consent to the way that they're being educated is not then going to become a provider who really understands what it means to consent for their patients. So they're going, however they're trained, they're going to go and they're going to practice medicine the way that they were trained. And so we've been working with a number of, we're building coalition with a number of medical and nursing student organizations so that we can work directly with students. We've been working with the American Medical Student Association. We're talking to other organizations like Med Students for Choice, and other nursing organizations that are supportive of students and many are student run, because they have to be a part of this. They have to be at the table, and they have to start to have a voice about what their education looks like, because medicine, like the norms in medicine start there. And so if we're not addressing medical education and the way that students are being indoctrinated into a system that is, that is teaching them that consent is not important, which is what we hear from students over and over again, that consent was never emphasized in my education. Yeah, we talked about it a little bit, but then it was never modeled, or I didn't get to sit in on consent conversations, so I don't even know what those conversations look like. I mean, we're completely missing the boat in not including students. So while I don't believe, and no one on our team believes, that it is the students' responsibility to change that system, We also know that there's a power in the students. If we can bring them together in collective power, that then there are ways we can change those norms and we can take on that system in a different way. So that is part of why we've really focused our efforts there. And I've very much become an advocate for medical students and nursing students who are being traumatized in their education. I mean, we have to see that it's not only the patients that are being traumatized by what is happening to their bodies when they are asleep, but it is also that we are teaching students that it is okay to violate patients to get the most efficient outcome or to get whatever their educational needs are met. And that is horrendous. And what that breeds is then new doctors that are going to continue to perpetuate that unless there's an intervention, unless we're having new conversations with them. So that has been a very, very big part of our work. In addition to working legislatively across the United States, we are developing a pledge program with students where they're writing it themselves. They're writing a pledge that they're going to take. And then that is going to be delivered to their administrators. The administrators we are going to work to get them on board with these organizations because that collective power is necessary to take on any kind of system like that. No individual can take on a system. That the collective power has to be there. And so that's where all of our organizing, all of bringing communities together, bringing different organizing efforts together, bringing different organizers to the table is so critically important. It's the only way we're going to change systems.
So Shira, did you have a comment?
Yes, I just wanted to say to Imagine's point, she's absolutely right. We have to collectively and collaboratively come to the table and be able to identify resources and supports that will work within the framework of community healing and moving forward with a restorative justice approach. And on the frameworks of holistic cultural elements, we have to acknowledge that the most marginalized, as well as those who continue to bear the face of ancestral trauma, are always going to be the ones that get forgotten. And when we look at the way that our economy is, we look at so many intersections that come with the breakdown of policy being overlooked. Because here's the thing, policy is there to protect us. But if people don't understand it and they don't understand how policy can also work in their favor, they get missed. The conversations are never had, they're never invited to the table, and they're never in the room. So when we come together, as we are right now on a panel discussion, we don't all do the same thing. We may come from similar walks of life, and we may have different passions behind our work. But the one thing that we can stand on is solidarity. And if we can just hold people accountable, the people who have the power need to be held accountable. And in closing, I'm sorry are two of the most powerful words that anyone can say. I'm sorry. And we don't hear enough of that. When those with power and influence and, stand behind policy come in front of us, there is an agenda. Move the agenda out the way, and let's first start with making amends. And then let's next start by simplifying the walk for us. When it's too wordy, when it's in Latin, and when it has so many other meanings behind meanings, people will never know that there are resources and there are sources available for them that can help them out of the disparities and the trauma that's caused by SA, that runs ancestral, that runs deep, that is systemic, and it's also rooted in white supremacy and anti-Black racism. If we're not bold enough to pull the curtail, if we're not bold enough to make the declaration that we don't want to hear anything you have to say if you're not speaking what we want to hear, it's okay that we shut those doors and amongst ourselves build community and strategy. And for those of us who have the answers, and for those of us who have been embedded and been committed to the work, we then have to go into our communities and build community as well as undo what has been done that has harmed us for so long.
I just want to, I'll actually name and mention that when we talk about a totem pole, right, we have to look, or I have to always bring into the room that trans people are at the bottom of that totem pole, indigenous people are at the bottom of that totem pole, undocumented people are at the bottom of this totem pole, are living in these traumatic spaces and not included. They're also pushed to the corners of our community and erased there. Like when we say community, the intention to bring everyone together is to make sure that we have a wider range of people that live in our community. We know that the history of trans people goes way back before we could remember. We also know that two-spirited is another form or another translation for trans people, and they're not in the conversation. And I think that it's as important and just as necessary to make sure that they're like elevated. When we level access, it depends on how many steps you have to take to get to that equal level so that everyone can have access to that. I think those are some of the things that like internally within communities need to happen, especially within Black communities. Church hurt is real, ostracizing is real. When you talk about being Black and trans in Atlantic City and such a trendsetter here, I know what it looks like to be pushed to a corner or not being received well. And I know many counterparts and many other folks that come from my walk or with my intersectionalities who feel like they can't even go to community. And we still have not talked about people who are still surviving sexual survivors who are still doing sex work, or people who are working 4 or 5 jobs who can't watch the news or show up in these spaces because the economy is so high. We have teachers that are now doing Uber drivers. We have other people who have a career that work for 30 years who can't keep up, and now they're picking up second jobs. And when they come home, they're tired, or when they come home, they want to decompress. And this holds a lot of space and a lot of energy. So like, I just don't want to leave them out of the room or out of the conversation as well, because it's hard out here. Like, it's really hard. And a lot of us are doing it alone or very, very sparse with little help. And I want to name that we need to make sure that they are somehow not forgotten, because their voices and their experiences are as important. When we do this for 20 years and it's our passion and drive, a lot of people are just trying to make it their ends meet. And I think they're very, very much need to be at the table.
Absolutely. Wow. Thank you to each of you. As we conclude our panel discussions, did anyone else have any final remarks that they would like to make, and how we can really ensure that the policies are promoting equity, healing, and liberation?
I mean, I think we just have to continue to do the visioning work. It's sometimes hard to look at the systems we have and think like from an abolitionist perspective, if like nothing, if none of this were here, what would we create? Like, let's go back to like, or start again from a place of vision of what it could look like, what could make it so miraculous and amazing, and where everyone, Samantha, could be in the room and everyone's voice is heard. Like, if we really come from that vision and then say, what are we going to need for that vision? Where are the gaps? What are the places that most need our attention? I think that's a way for us to keep ourselves proactive rather than always having like, we have to be reactive. There's an onslaught of horrible policy being put forward right now, and we have to react to that, but also like staying true and staying anchored and rooted in our vision, I think is the way forward to creating systems that actually work for all of us, which I believe we can do. I don't know if they're these systems, but I think we can do that.
Imagine, thank you for that. I think one of the things that I am wanting to leave with is that we have to go within our own work. and look at the areas and the holes that we have in it. I think in these retreats that we're having, in these council meetings that we're having, in these conversations, in these team meetings or these collaborative things, we do a lot of things well. I want you to go back through and look at what you don't do well, you haven't addressed, or is a mirroring or something that's burning within your organization that you're turning a blind eye to. If we do that, I think that we will start to find and build better relationships with other people doing that work that mirror us. I think we will also be intentional with being inclusive to those spaces, or having our ear to the ground to know that you're not doing things in that area or that arena well. And knowledge is power. So I don't think that I wish everyone's budget would quantify by $2 or $3 million dollars, annually. Yes, I want that for all of us. And even with smaller budgets or smaller groups, we have to name, we don't represent trans people well in our organization. We're missing our Latinx community. Have we discussed disability justice? Have we been intentional? Do we have a pulse on what's going on with rural areas compared to our inner city areas, right? Do we have an understanding on not just sexual assault, but depression and alcoholism and all of the other things? So when we talk about a wraparound approach, I think that, yes, it's good to use our voice on the external and to push our own messages of what's right and wrong. But I think a lot of us, and during these retreat spaces, during these meetings and these debriefs, you got the email, let the email go. It's not just that. Let's do some deep core work within our own organization or community or cohort to really look at what areas we're not serving or what areas that we have not been able to touch yet. And I'm not saying that you're going to be able to touch it if you already have a plan in place, but it has to be added into that plan, or you have to be able, when dealing with community, know that you're not the expertise or you're not holding space right now for that. And sometimes just being, we haven't touched the trans community. We're not getting the response that we want. We haven't touched the, the immigration community or the indigenous community. Could you help us? Could you partner with us, or could you point us in the right direction to who we need to speak to these areas? I think those are some things that change the quality of how you're showing up for your community. And I think you get a lot more respect when people see you asking your community and constituencies to point you in the directions and to help shape and mold the vision of the work you're doing. So I think that's important as well.
And I couldn't agree more. I feel like when we miss any person in any community, then we have missed every community. It's important that we start with making the proper assessments. And as community leaders, being the executive director of a grassroots nonprofit that's centered around reproductive justice, it means that I need to meet people where they're at. But how can I do that if I don't have enough information about them? If my intake, where it starts with the conversation, doesn't ask those questions that no one else is going to think about. It may start with, where'd you grow up? What was the dynamics of your family? And it starts with that one piece of information. Well, I grew up in foster care. Okay, stop right there. I don't have to go any further to know that I need to be meeting this person, as well as creating programs and services that support the trauma that's there. We have to begin to embody what trauma-informed really means. Trauma-informed simply creates the space for us to, number one, be humanistic, number two, be compassionate, and number three, we have to be able to move all of the, politics and, all of the political jargon and the need to be politically correct. Move that out the way, and let's just be human for a moment. We are hurting. Samantha shared how school teachers are driving Uber just to make ends meet. Bread is $5. And when we look at the fact that the disparities have grown darker and deeper, but our money hasn't grown, we're still forced to do a lot with little. And I think the greatest piece of support, the greatest element of justice, the greatest element of healing, and most importantly, the greatest value is held in our ability to make impact. You know, we don't have to take these spaces and dominate it with talking about the past. Some people say, you know, we don't want to hear about slavery. We don't want to hear about racism. We don't want to hear about that, but we have to talk about it. You know, the fact that it's still in front of us and it continues to morph into so many other violations of human rights right in front of us. You know, it's like we're afraid to talk about housing injustice, you know, environmental and climate injustice that goes all the way back to 1667, where one Black slave was, you know, attached to 60 additional acres of land right in New Jersey. You know, we don't have the conversations where they need to start. And we sometimes have to go all the way back. And then we have to work our way forward. And after we work our way forward, now that everything is on the table, it's like that 15,000 piece jigsaw puzzle. You have to start, you know, categorizing, and you have to compartmentalize. You know, no one just dumps out all those pieces and, you know, within 10 minutes, you're able to put that puzzle together. No, for many of us, it takes a lifetime. And many of us, you know, respectively, we are the pieces, we are the fragments of puzzles. We're the fragments of families and communities. We're the fragments of ancestral trauma. We're the fragments, but yet we're also those who have emerged stronger. You know, we are the ones who did not get swallowed up by the grief and by the trauma. And while there may have been some, like my mother, that, you know, did not make it through, you know, my mother crossed over at 36 years old. You know, my mother also, you know, spent her last 3 years of her life incarcerated. My mother spent the last 3 years of her life living through her trauma. My mother was a heroin user, but she wasn't an addict. She was traumatized. My mother had the experience of sexual trauma that went unaddressed. Like most Afro-Latino and BIPOC families, you know, there are things that we live with. And where you see one, there are many. You know, many of our stories look the same and sound the same, but our victories need to sound the same too. You know, we've been able to pull ourselves out because of education and upward mobility, but that's not everyone's story. And I think we need to begin to put some continuity as well as some infrastructure that those who have been the most marginalized, ostracized, and terrorized, they need to have access to healing, restoration, as well as community inside of their own community. They shouldn't have to go outside of their community of where the trauma began to get healed. They should be able to be healed within their community where the trauma began.
Thank you all so much for your insightful conversations. And to our audience, thank you for joining us today. And we hope that you'll carry forward the ideas shared today and turn them into actionable initiatives to make meaningful and effective change for survivors. Thank you.